एक तारा की तरफ से आप सबका स्वागत है। आप जानते हैं कि रियाज इलस्ट्रेशन के इलाके में 5 साल से जारी एक पहल है। एक तारा और टाटा ट्रस्ट का ये साझा प्रयास है। इसमें आज प्रोफेसर इंद्रप्रमित रॉय 19वीं सदी के शुरुआती समय से लेकर आजादी के ठीक पहले के वक्त के बंगाल में हुए इलस्ट्रेशन के कामों पर विचार करें। इसके दूसरे भाग को आप 30 तारीख यानी कि अगले शुक्रवार हम आजादी के बाद के काम पर व्याख्यान को सुनेंगे। अब प्रोफेसर रॉय का संक्षिप्त में इंट्रोडक्शन। So Professor Roy did his Bachelor's of Fine Arts in printmaking at Vishwabharati University of Shantiniketan and in painting at the Faculty of Fine Arts, MS University, Baroda. He was later awarded the Inlac Scholarship to study MA in painting at the Royal College of Art, London. In his 3-decade-long career as a painter, he has had 16 solo and 2 duo shows to his credit. He has participated in group shows in several major cities in India, as well as some international venues. In 2013, he completed a 12 by 26 feet mural for Terminal 2 of the New Mumbai International Airport, जिसका अब नाम जय हो म्यूजियम हो गया है. His honors and fellowships include the Inlac Scholarship, Government of India Junior Research Fellowship, Fulbright Fellowship USA, and recently the Artist in Residence at the Siena Art Institute. Professor Roy has an abiding interest in illustrating for children. 2 of his illustrated books won Museum Publishing Award in the US and Alcuin Children's Book Award in Canada. He has been teaching painting at his alma mater, Faculty of Fine Arts, MS University, Baroda, since 1995. So it's a huge pleasure to have you here today, Professor Roy. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. Yeah, as you may have figured, I am a painter by profession and also a teacher. But illustration is something that has always been my interest, because I think most people, when they learn to read, the first form of visual art that they are exposed to is the illustration of the books. Because I was very interested in reading, illustrations was the first thing that I noticed as a form of visual art. And from there on, everything else started. So I think in the formation of the formative years of any young person, books play a very important role. Of course, now you have the possibility of e-books and other forms of electronically transmitted books. But whichever form you may be talking about, the illustrations that are part of the text, they become intrinsic part of the text, have always remained a very important trigger. So the quality of the illustration, the richness of it, or the history of illustration, so to speak, I think is a very important aspect of the development of children's literature in any language. Now, living in India has its own problems, as you all know. And so that's why I'm concentrating on one part, which has a very particularly illustrious history. I'm sure this can apply to other parts, other languages, and somebody will come forward to do that. But before I begin, I'd like to thank Iktara for arranging this, for giving this opportunity to reach out and talk about things to an audience which is obviously interested in this subject. Now, children's book illustration in Bengal has a rather long history, so I thought I'll divide it into 2 parts. And so the first part is today, which talks about the beginning years. But before I even go into the nitty-gritty of it, one must understand that illustration for children's book has to presuppose a genre called children's books. Now, children's books means there is something specifically directed at children. Now, that is not a given ever since the beginning of mankind, because this whole category, the children require special handling, the children require special literature, has come to us. That realization dawned on us rather late in the day. I mean, if you look at the international scene, not before 16th century, and in English speaking world, it's mostly in the late 17th century that people actually woke up to this possibility that children is a separate category, they needed literature, and hand in hand comes the presentation of it, that it has to be illustrated, that it needs to have the visual element in it. That is not to say that people did not say stories for children, or there was nothing for children before this category children's literature came into usage. But we are going to primarily talk about the printed book and the printed illustration. And that category evolved pretty much in the 19th century. Initially, there was this theory of Mr. John Locke that children are like a tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is like a clean slate. So the parents have the responsibility, society has the responsibility to inscribe in that tabula rasa things that we wanted the child to learn. And in a way, this was the beginning. Now we of course know that nobody is a tabula rasa. People, there are genetically predispositions there. But it has been generally accepted and widely acknowledged that children do need their special literature. Great children's literature is not just restricted to children. They appeal to both grown-ups and the child. Children's literature now also is segmented into children's literature, that's for very young children. Then you have juvenile literature, which is for the slightly grown-ups. You have something now called teen lit, and all kinds of segments are made. But by and large, everything we are looking at in this Rubicon of children's literature. Now, like I said, the beginning starts with very much the advent of printing. And before printing, there is a little prehistory, so to speak. I'll get into that. But William Carey, who set up his mission press in the precincts of Sri Rampur Church in 1800, that's right at the beginning of 19th century, was instrumental in starting to print books in Bangla, in Bengali. But they were not just printing books in Bengali, they were printing books in many other Asian languages, because that was the hub, that was the printery of the missionaries. So in the next 37 years, so by 1837, they have printed 212,000 copies of various languages, 24 languages to count actually. And the first illustrated book was also appeared pretty soon, and that is Bharat Chandra's Annada Mangal. It's a story of Annada and his travels through life and love. Very popular story, predating the era of printing. But that was the first book that was printed with illustration. And it's an interesting history because the guy who was the publisher, Gangakishore Bhattacharya, himself started life as a compositor in the mission press. And he later had his own press. He moved to Calcutta. But he employed a man to do these illustrations and paid quite a fortune. I'll come to that. But before that, let me just go back to the 10th century, when when you have illustrations of books. But at that point of time, there was no special category called children's books. So this is a palm leaf manuscript from the Pala dynasty. You know, Pala dynasty covered what is today Bihar, Odisha, West Bengal, Bangladesh. So it was a very powerful ruling dynasty. And the illustrations those days were made on palm leaves, and there is traces of the Ajanta tradition, the last traces, so to speak, that you could see then. So text will be on both sides, and in the center there was illustrated images. These are painted images, of course. So India has many kinds of traditions of storytelling through pictures. You have the Pabuji Parks in Rajasthan, for instance. You have the Pata paintings of Bengal, which talks about stories. There are many traditions. You know, there is the Kawad tradition in Rajasthan of the roaming folks who sing the ballads. There are also elements of things which will appeal to the children. But like I said, there was no special category for children. And even when printing started, there was really nothing addressed to the children. So we had to wait for the last 3 decades of 19th century for that to happen. But it was this is the one of the 6 illustrations that were published in the first illustrated book, so to speak, which is like a iconic thing, is the historical fact that Another Mangal that I mentioned, and the man who did the plays was Ramchand Roy, and it was engraved by a man called Madhav Chandra Das. And apparently the illustrators were paid 1 gold coin for each of the illustrations. 6 illustrations meant 6 gold coins. So the price of the book was quite a royal sum for those days, 4 rupees. But it obviously sold well. Otherwise, this would have been not sustainable. So there was a demand for quality books. And this is one of those 6 illustrations. They're very archaic. And mind you, the art of printing was already prevalent, but not as part of books. It evolved from popular traditions of printing in the Bottala region, which is near the Chitpur Road of Calcutta. And many publishers were concentrated there. They were not necessarily printing text, but they were also making woodblock prints. And those woodblock prints were of 2 kinds. They had a secular sort of comments on the society kind of thing, or popular news items, or religious images. So these were the basically 2 things from where these block makers, engravers emerged eventually and worked for the publishing industry within a generation's time. So the bazaar paintings of Kalighat, for instance, had a very strong popular tradition, which were all hand painted, and then eventually within 100 years, blocks started being made when wooden blocks, the technology wooden blocks was popular. So the same images will be replicated in the wooden blocks. And like I said, apart from the religious themes, you have to deal with social themes, satirical themes, anything that was popular. And this was also the beginning of the newspapers. So the social scandals, which gained traction, like the Mohanto Elokeshi scandal. There were numerous prints made of it, mostly imaginary, of Elokeshi being murdered, Mohanto on trial, being enraged by the news of their affair and all that sort of stuff. And there was a strong element of scandal because the Mohanto was the Mohanto of the Tarakeshwar temple, the Shiv temple. So it was a religious head who got involved in scandal. So if you think that that only pertains to our age, then that is not the case. You know, it has always been, people loved these salacious, gossipy things. And obviously there was a market for it and people catered to it. Or even commentary women actually guides, becomes the ruler of the husband, and hence the mother-in-law is in chains. This is the subject of this. And this is a woodblock print that happened more or less around the same time when the first book started appearing. But these were not part of books. These were individual prints. And sometimes these were also hand-colored. Don't miss the Vaishnavite mark on the forehead of the cat. So it's a Vaishnavite cat which is enjoying its lobster, which again is a very colloquial way of making a snide comment on this priest class or the religious heads of different sects. And you will see numerous references to that in later Bengali literature about the corruption that one sees within the structured religious sects and bodies and mutts and mohans. And so these are the sort of preamble, and thereby emerged a whole range of artists who were very deft at woodblock engraving, which is what was primarily the form of block making. And then that was slowly replaced by metal engraving. This Priyagopal Dash was one of the most well-known and most accomplished artists of the late 19th century who excelled in both the forms. So very often artists would actually get their blocks made by him. So he was an artist himself of very high caliber, but he was also a block maker who made blocks for others. So the first book, which is specifically designed for children, appeared sometime in 1822. And then it was republished. Volume 1 was published, then volume 2 was published. And it was initially published by these two British gentlemen called W.H. Pearce and John Lawson. And funnily, the book is called Animal Biography in the first edition, and then both English and Bangla, and the name in Bangla was given Pashwabuli or Pashabuli in Bangla, as you would pronounce it. And what was it? It is basically talking about both wild and domesticated animals. It has everything from lions to rhinoceros to elephants to tigers to donkeys to dogs and cats. And there would be an image and a little note on the habits of it or the description of it. So in a way, the purpose was didactic, but it was very richly illustrated. It was illustrated in every page. So on the left, you have the part 2 of the animal biography, and on the right is the first part. One talks about the ass, the other talks about the lion. And possibly it was Lawson was one of the artists, but we don't know for sure. But in a way, this was historically, to the best of our knowledge, the first book that got printed in both languages, English and Bangla, and continued to be in print from 22 to about 29. So obviously it was quite popular because repeated editions were printed, and eventually 3 volumes, both in 2 languages, and every page was illustrated with an image. But after that, you have a bit of a gap because what you see in the middle of 19th century, a lot of books were being published. There was a school book society which was actually printing and supplying books to the burgeoning schools that were replacing the traditional patshalas and tolls. But those were mostly educational books, and like our conception of educational instructional books, they were unfortunately not illustrated, or nobody really paid much attention to that aspect. So specifically books targeted at the young audience started coming up only in the 1880s. One of the first was called Sakha. It then joined with another magazine which came up thereabouts at the same time called Sathi and became Sakha or Sathi. What is interesting is that in the first page, this you see one page, it's called My Favorite Cat. You see great influence of Edwardian illustration techniques, Victorian illustration techniques. I mean, it almost looks like it's borrowed from some book published in England, but it was all wood block prints. Now, what is noteworthy is in the title page itself, it's stated in English, child is the father of man. So here was an attempt to cater to the needs of the child, to entertain him, to engage the child, rather than just giving instructions in a very dry manner, So, and that is the beginning of books targeting children. And in this case, it was the magazines which, majorly started the trend. And many of them came up in a very short span of time. I'll just briefly scan some of them so you have some idea. And the technique used was mostly woodblock printing till metal engraving becomes the norm. This was Hashikushi by Jogin Sarkar. I'm sorry, the name is kind of getting covered with my visage. But Jogin Sarkar remained in circulation till my childhood, and I suspect he's still read. He wrote a very popular book of verses called Hashikushi, which almost every child Chora Ochobi is another of his collections of these little rhymes and verses. So this was one of the first books that was published by Jogin Sarkar, who was also part of the School Book Society, and a firm believer that it's not just instructional and didactic books that are required for children, but children needed to be taught things in an entertaining manner. So you have to understand something like the children's mind. Child psychology was still a little distant away, but there was thinking going on about this fact that, like I said, since the end of 17th century, that children do require very special care and handling. So there is a different category, and especially young children, and you have to keep them engaged to develop their mental growth. And you have to also simultaneously entertain in the, not just instruct. So they need to love the book, they have to fall for that book, and it becomes very part and parcel of their growing up years. And that, is the basis of any children's literature developing. If you are only instructing people in the ethical moral values and do's and don'ts, or instructing them, or just giving them dry facts and figures, that is not considered children's literature by any stretch of imagination. And this is Priyagopal Dash and his wood engraving. So you can see that how fine an artist he was. And in those days, any reproduction has to be ultimately converted into a block to be printed. And these were done manually. So this manual work was done by very, very sophisticated block makers. There's a whole range of them, sophisticated to very crude. Priyagopal belonged to the highest echelon of block making, because his works were comparable with, if you call it, international standards. He was definitely one of the best. And his name will keep reappearing for uh, contributing either as an artist or both as an artist and a block maker, or just as a block maker repeatedly in terms of illustration per se. And in our case, our interest and our focus will be in children's literature. So there, so this is a name to remember. And this is not necessarily a work meant for children, but I'm sharing it to give you an idea of the high level of skill that he possessed. Shati is another magazine that came about in the 1880s, late 1880s. And again, all these magazines were addressing a variety of subjects and topics. You know, it would have travel stories, it'll have poems, it'll have instructional material, it'll have how to do things, it will have games, and they were all quite richly illustrated. It will have poems, it will have little essays. So the structure of what we now understand to be a children's magazine was already set by 1880s. Even Tagore's family was very engaged in producing children's literature. Balak was a man, Gyanada Nandini Devi, his middle elder brother's wife, in 1885. And many people in the Tagore household actually wrote in this, and they also illustrated it. And not everything was in-house, but Balok was very strongly associated with the Tagore household. And as you know, the Tagore household, at the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was a hub of activity. So whether it's theater, whether it's painting, whether it's music, whether it's theater, whether it's children's literature, you know, you cannot really bypass the Tagore household of Jorasanko, because somebody or the other was engaged in all of these activities, and Tagore himself was there for everything. And Abanindranath, of course, majorly. Jyotindranath, Satyendranath, Gyanada Nandini Devi. So the wives, his brothers, his cousins, all were one way or the other engaged. So it was a very fertile ground, and there was no dearth of material to print. Balok ran for many years. Nandini eventually taken over by Charala, who was Rabindranath's eldest sister. And it was another repository where you see a lot of activity happening, which is focused towards specifically the children. And Roy and Sons started operating in the late 1880s. Again, like I said, the 1880s seems to be one of the crucial decades as far as children's publishing is concerned. By 1899, they were producing very high quality reproductions. The new Ray happens to be Upendra Kishore Roy, or Ray Chaudhary as they were originally called. He was the first generation of the Rays who established himself not only as a writer, but also as an illustrator, a publisher, an editor, a very fine blockmaker, a technician who wrote and published articles in Penrose Annual, and actually invented certain forms of halftone printing, which was revolutionary in those days, you know. And he kind of published those articles in Penrose Annual, got them published. You know, there were certain restrictions about dots per line, and it was assumed that certain number of dots are only doable in so many lines of halftone, and he proved that almost double that number is possible. And for that, he made his own block. He was a photographer. He was an amateur photographer. He was also an amateur musician. He was a violinist, a man of many parts, and he wrote extensively for children. He's illustrated his own books, and finally, he started a children's magazine, which is an iconic children's magazine, which is, although a little irregular, is still being published today. It's called Sandesh, or the sweet sandesh, but it has a double meaning. It meant both the sandesh as good news and sandesh as something that you eat, a sweetmeat favored by children. So I will come to that. It requires a little more detailed looking into. But that is the achievement of this guy who died in his, he was only 40 odd years when he passed away. And this was the level of his achievement, which was then taken forward by his very able son. And let's look at some of the works of the Ure and Sons. What you see here is the cover of Mukul, another children's magazine, which was printed. This is actually the title page, not the actual cover. The cover is gone, which is printed in halftone. So this was one of the first examples of a children book using halftone printing, whereby a photographic image can mechanically be reproduced without the intervention of the block maker, who would have to cut the block manually. So technology and the quality of illustrations are always related, because ultimately illustrations are reaching the target audience through a process, and technology is that process. So if bad technique or archaic technique is used, then you get a certain quality. With the evolution of technology, the quality of the illustration also changes, the nature of the illustration changes. So of course, now we are living in an era where almost anything and everything is possible. Whatever, if you have a little watercolor mark, even that can be reproduced. But we are talking about the end of 19th century, where these must have looked miraculous to people who were seeing a printed photographic image mass produced by this halftone technique. And this is, mind you, specifically targeted at the child audience or the young audience. And this was a special issue for the celebration of the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. So there were a lot of articles on the Queen and the reign of the Queen, etc., etc. It was a special number. So obviously special care was taken. But just to give you an idea of the technology shift, yeah. And so we already had halftone printing coming. And then in 1907, which is another landmark year in the publication history of children's books of Bengal, is this book Sack, which was written and illustrated by a man called Dakshinaranjan Mitra Majumdar. He researched for 12 long years. He actually collected stories from every jila, every district of Bengal that is now covering the whole of West Bengal and Bangladesh. And he reproduced in writing the same tone and tenor. He did not purify it, Sanskritize it. He actually basically transcribed that oral tradition into. And subsequently, he produced 3 other books, Thakurda Juli, and quite a few others. But this book is still being published. And all the illustrations, interestingly, goes back to an earlier style. It's almost like Charlie Chaplin making a silent film in the era of talkies. He chooses to opt a technique which by then was on its way out, and you had a better technology. And why did he do it? To retain certain quality, and because these are timeless tales. These are actually oral tales collected from village grandmas. And there is a background history to it. The background being that in 1905, Lord Curzon decided to partition Bengal on communal lines, which eventually happened in 1947. But in 1905, there was a great resistance to that idea because it was seen as a very clever ploy of the British Raj to weaken the rising nationalist fervor in Bengal by bringing in this communal issue of a Muslim majority part and a Hindu majority part. So everybody, especially the thinking, educated class and the elite, resisted this idea tooth and nail. And this was the birth of Swadeshi. And in that moment, a lot of things got written. Vande Mataram became one of the war cries. Then Abanindranath's Bharat Mata was painted around that time. Abanindranath joined the Government Art College, and we changed the idea of modernism in India, the emergence of Bengal school. So in the cultural domain, a lot of people were resisting it. And Dakshinaranjan felt that all these stories are being lost and they're being superseded by imported fairy tales that our children are more familiar with than what has been handed down over generations. So he went out and spent 12 long years collecting those stories, collating them, and keeping the original tone and tenor of it. And that is why when Tagore, Rabindranath, introduced this book, he wrote the introduction for it. He hailed it as a great Swadeshi act, that in this deluge of foreign goods, which included foreign books, here is a man who is looking back, and what could be more Swadeshi than this? This was exactly paraphrasing what Tagore wrote in the introduction to this book. And Dakshinaranjan illustrated them, and he took help of others. One of them was Priyagopal Dash, who actually engraved these plates, and you could see that they also reflect a certain taste and visual aesthetics, which is very much to do with the Bartala prints or local theater traditions, but additionally introducing a sense of perspective, which is again related to the scene paintings in theater. But in people's dresses, in people's spaces, the palaces, they're all hybrid. They are not, there's nothing, sort of classical about it. They very much are a product of 18th and 19th century imagination. So, and some of them are quite uh, graphically gripping, like these are the Rakshasas or the Kokshasas, or, these are all part of these fairy tales. And there is usually a king, there is a queen, there are these sons and daughters, and, the traditional format of the fairy tale. But the special quality is that retaining that tone and tenor of an orally spoken story in the written form. And it is so hugely popular that it's still being printed. Of course, they have replaced the wood blocks with metal blocks, but the same illustration, the same type font. I have a copy, which was the 44th edition, published in 2003. Until then, there were 2 lakh 30,000 copies of this book printed and distributed. And you can imagine that this one book would not be read by just one person. So multiple people would read it. So you get an idea. And then it was made into animations, that was made into audio recordings. So these are really hugely, hugely popular for almost, well, why almost? More than a century. And there were some colored plates also, but you could see that the color plates had their issues. This was the early days of color halftone printing, which was very much something that Upendra Kishore was also working on, and then his son Sukumar. I'll come to that. Upendra Kishore wrote for children many things. He wrote this book called Tuntunir Boi, which is again something that everybody reads even now. which is about a little bird, a tuntuni, which is just one of the smallest birds. It's a sort of honeysucker kind of a bird, and how its smartness, beats the competitors or antagonists like the cat. And then there are other sort of fableish stories with animals involving other creatures also. All the illustrations were done by him. Then he did a small translation called Chelede Ramayan, which is the story of Ramayan. He also wrote scientific treatises like Shekaler Kotha, which talked about the past, the prehistory, dinosaurs, the origin of the world, and such things. And eventually, what is remembered most steadfastly, apart from Tuntunir Boi and Chelede Ramayan, is the establishment of Sandesh, which he could only edit for 2 years because he passed away in 1915 at a very, very young age. And then it was taken over by his brother for a while and it stopped publication. And then Sukumar, his son, who is also a very noted writer, and I'll come to him. So the contribution of the race in the evolution of Bengali literature is so important that I'll have to talk about the third generation, that is Satyajit Ray, in the post-independent section. So one family has contributed so heavily in this area. These are some of the illustrations of Upendra Kishore. I'm just showing you a quick sampling. This is Tuntuni and the story of the barber. These are some ghost stories that he illustrated. These are all metal engravings. But in Ramayana, there are some color plates. And these are all in the first decade of 20th century. And all these books were produced and printed at the Uray and Sons Press. And this is where his articles appeared. This is the cover of the Penrose Annual of 1901, where he explained how that number of lines and dots, that assumption is wrong. And he proved his point by sharing this photograph that he printed. It's his own photograph that he printed in his own press in 2 colors. It's called The Witch of Goom. It's a 110-line reproduction by Uray and Sons. And his article, that the first article was a very short article. It's called How Many Dots? That is, how many dots per line is doable. So he was a technician who was very, very focused in quality children's literature. So in a way, Bengal children's literature wouldn't have produced the kind of quality that it did without the intervention of such people. So in a way, they're very lucky to have such people of such stature engaged in writing, spreading children's literature of the highest quality. Sukumar, his son, again, was the first person to write nonsense verse. You cannot talk about Bengali literature without talking about Sukumar Ray and his nonsense verses. But he was an active person in printing technology because he also went to study photo engraving and lithography in London, and he published in Penrose, and he also did invent certain technologies which were quite radical for the day, and continued to edit Sandesh. Most of his writings appeared in the children's mag Sandesh, and only one book was published in his lifetime, which is known as Hajobor Law. And he died even younger than his father. He was barely 35 years when he died. Satyajit Ray was just 2 years old when he lost his father. But in that very short span, Shukumar introduced the genres of absurd and the nonsense that even Tagore wanted to emulate, and I'll come to that. Abul Tabul is a book that was almost ready for publication. He died on the 10th of September. The book was in press. The layout was done, printing has started, only the binding was remaining. So finally, the book was published 9 days after he died. And what a book it was! It shook up the whole world of children's literature in Bengal. Abul Tabul literally means ulta pulta. And it is 46 verses. What I'm sharing with you is a translation, quite a good translation, but it still can't get the nuance of the original. It's translated by Professor Shukanta Chaudhary, who is taught for many years comparative literature in Jadavpur University. And this is where you have these combination animals, a tota and a girgit, a bakri and a bichu. Uh, uh, um, you can see it yourselves. And the whole verse is about the confusion about what would they eat, because one half of the body wants something and the other half wants to go the other way. So if you have a gajakachap kind of um, hybrid animals, then what would be the confusion? And this is the original cover of the book that was designed by Ray himself. So he was an illustrator, a humorist, a writer of he also was excellent in writing satirical verses, and some of the verses of Abul Tabul actually can be read as not only absurd but also satirical. So they appeal to the child at one level and they appeal to the grown up in another level. I share just one, and I would beg for indulgence if you can read this. And I will read it for people who may have difficulty of watching it on the phone if the image is too small. In Bangla, it's called bhai peona. Don't be scared. The English translation says an invitation. It's this horrible looking, ghastly looking character with a mace in hand, and there's obviously somebody running away for the saving the life of his. And so this creature is addressing the human and saying, "Oh, don't be scared. Please don't be scared." It starts bhai peona in Bangla. I don't intend to beat you. Believe me, if we fought about, I never could defeat you. My heart is of a kindly sort. I'm gentle in my habit. I really couldn't crunch your neck or even try to grab it. Perhaps it's these unfortunate horns that complicate the issue. My forehead's in a tender state. I cannot biff or squish you. So come and see my humble home and take a little rest. We wouldn't spare the slightest care to please an honored guest. Ah, now I know. This cudgel, then, is really why you linger. Why, bless my soul, it's light as pith. It wouldn't crack a finger. What? Still unsure? Why, really, sir, you will start to hurt my feelings. I'll twist your neck or crush your leg to add to my appealings. There's me, my missus, 9 stout sons, the whole lot at your service. We'll bite you all together now if you don't stop being nervous. So you see, there's a change in the tone, and it's obvious from the very beginning that what he says is not what he means. So this whole absurd play of somebody who's as horrendous as this creature is saying to sort of trying to lure this guy in his trap by saying all these polite and kind words, it rings true even today. I mean, when I read this, I think of so many things that are part of our contemporary life. I leave that to your imagination to figure out, um, because I'm sure it will ring bells with everyone. And these are some other characters. The one on the left is a guy who says Hashi Nishedh, or the sign reads laughter not allowed, and he cannot laugh. It's a self-imposed restriction, and everything conspires to make him laugh. Look at the clouds, look at the trees. They all have funny faces, but he can't laugh. And his original name is Ramgururet Chana. And that's, it's very difficult to translate these things. Or Kumro Potash, which is translated as pumpkin puff. He's a guy who, it's a warning that if he's out, then you have to do all kinds of absurd things. So that's where how the verses go. And without these images, these verses, there have been artists who have attempted to do variations of this, but the originals, like Sir John Tenniel's illustration of Alice in Wonderland, it is very difficult to replace that because it's so embedded in your imagination for generations. It's not just one generation. The blighty cow, you know, it's a sickly blighty cow which has cough and cold and sneezes, and it is there in Harubabu's office. So the poet is inviting people to go and take a look at it and decide for themselves whether it's a cow, whether it's a bird, what kind of a creature is this, and then he's describing certain mannerisms and habits, which actually talks about certain very well, I wouldn't go into that. It is some of the characteristics that people talk about, the clerical class of people, or people who are too preconscious, or too scared of stepping out, and too careful about their health and hearth and stuff like that. People who try to play it very safe. So it in a way, it is also a critique of that. And the title itself, the image, is also again referring to a certain hybridity, which is you see in many of these 52 verses. Only 7 of them has titles, and 7, I think, they don't have a title. And every part of it, this is the character which is translated. It's called Huko Muko Hangla. Huko is the smoking thing that used in rural Bengal, with coconut shell at the bottom, which is filled with water, so it makes a sound like a gargada or a shisha. But it's a very rustic form of a shisha, where you have the thing burning on the top, and then the tobacco, and it passes through the water that is in that coconut shell. It's a smoking device, basically. So his head is referred to visually as a reference to that. But the confusion here is that he's sitting in this tree trunk and wondering that, okay, I have got a pair of tails, not one, but two. And what if a fly, I know if it flies on the right, I can swap it with the right tail. If it sits on the left, I can swap it with the left tail. But what exactly happens if it sits exactly in the center? Which tail do I use and how? This is the apparent confusion that the lug-headed loon, as he's translated, is having. And these are some tailpieces of the only book that was published in his lifetime that I say, which is a kind of a take on Alice in Wonderland, of a young boy who's daydreaming this world where all these characters appear. And again, that also has references to mathematics, to judiciary, to pronouncements, to how you write a legal document. Everything is kind of very gently mocked at. And this character on the left is called Hijibijbij. He just can't stop laughing because he imagines things, and he laughs, and he then gets hurt himself by laughing so much. And he wants you to stop him laughing, but he cannot. Poor chap. He just imagines things and laughs. The what if. So the whole story of his appearance is revolving around, he's just thinking of these totally absurd things, and the protagonist is saying, but why are you even thinking? But he then pops up another thing and goes rolling over, laughing his head off. Nera, or ganja in Hindi, is a guy who is literally bald-headed, and he comes as a sort of jatra artist whose job was to intervene between the scenes and sings, and he cannot sing um, for Adam, but he insists on singing, and he has these absurd songs written and rolled up in his pocket. So if you want any kind of song, he will take out and start singing, and he's very polite, but he takes offense at the slightest opportunity. So this novella is full of such characters, and then ultimately the boy wakes up from the dream and says that, the grown-ups don't believe these things, so I'm sharing it in confidence with you. And this is the last quote to the scene, where the judgment pronounced is 7 days of hanging and 3 months of jail, or something very absurd like that. And of course, the judge is an owl which is sleeping but claims that there is some problem in his eyes. There is a very clever by half fox which is arguing the case of the prosecution, and so on and so forth. So it takes a dig at the judicial system and the absurdity of some of the practices. And Pagladashu, which is another iconic book of the school exploits of a chap called Pagladashu, Dasharati, called Dashu by everybody. And you don't really know whether he's mad or he's very smart. And he kind of takes the mickey out of all his classmates, but he's also a very empathetic character. And he does things his way. So he's not somebody whom you can discipline. So the exploits of Pagla Dashu is basically what this book is about. And this had to wait for 17 years. Some of the stories were published in the pages of Sandesh, but it was first published as a book in 1940, and ever since has remained a classic. And in the 1960s, Ray redesigned the cover and the get-up of the whole book, but this is the original cover that uses Sukumar Ray's illustration. I will show you in the next opportunity the comparison of this one and Ray's design. And Tagore and Nandalal Bose. This is one of the good fortunes of Bengali literature as well as the world of illustration, is that great personalities contributed to children's literature as well as illustration. They never shied away from it. I cannot think of any language where a Nobel laureate would write a primer for the very young children. And that's exactly what Tagore did. Shajbaat is a book of primers. And Nandalal illustrated it par excellence. And in Shantiniketan those days, there was no money, there was very little technology. So he used linocut, one of the most basic ways of printing technology, of relief printing, that you cut out a lino sheet, you roll ink on it, and you print it. And it can be printed in a regular press. And that's how Shajbaat was written. Shajbaat 1, Shajbaat 2, Shajbaat 3, all of them, they came out around 1930s. And this is a jugalbandi of sorts between Tagore and Nandalal. And this is awe and ah. So the verses are written by Tagore and the illustrations are all done by Nandalal. You see how amazing distribution of black and white, which is ever since has remained a sort of standard, gold standard to which you constantly refer back, including people like artist K.G. Subramanian when he did his illustrations. A-oi and O-O. And the illustrations are not literally illustrating what is written in the text, so they have sort of oblique references sometimes, but they're so evocative that opens the mind of the child. And this is, imagine, this is a primer, so this will be the first book that anybody reads. See the distribution of the black and white, just as an artwork, it is exceptional. And the means are so simple. So What I was saying in the beginning, that technology do change the quality of illustration. But if you think that it's only technology, then we are much mistaken, and that is actually this is disproved by works like these. The technology here is so basic that even a kid can handle it, but the quality of the work, irrespective of the technology, it's actually knowing how to use the technology. So even a simple technology can achieve excellent results. Just a few more illustrations from Shajbaat 1, Shajbaat Bhag 2, Bhag 3. You cannot have it any more simple. Cha, cha, ja, ja. These are the pages. And then it goes to rhyming, juktakshars, the combined letters. And it's about the same time that these iconic works were done by Nandalal on of Gandhiji. And on the right, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Unfortunately, his face is being covered. This is a later part of Shajpat where you are introduced to simple rhyming. বনে থাকে বাঘ, গাছে থাকে পাখি, জলে থাকে মাছ, ডালে আছে ফল, পাখি ফল খায়, পাখা মেলে ওড়ে. And this is sort of a medallion of an image that is printed in that page. Each page had a sort of image, and they're all done by Nandalal. And this Navindranath's at an earlier occasion, I talked about one of the works from his series on Arabian Nights, and this is one of those great could have beens, also from 1930. And this was never printed because printing technology required to print these images was just not available. They're very, very subtle toned images painted in wash. They were also not seen for almost 70 years after they painted. They were lying in some trunk. So people knew about it. One or two works were seen, but the whole body of work, there were 45 works done, was never seen before till the thing came out in a book form in uh, early 21st century. So this is a could have been also because Abanindranath couldn't care about publication. He just did it for his own sake. But imagine if these illustrations of Arabian Nights were printed, it would have been a landmark event. And that day is still waiting. I mean, here is this old Sindbad the sailor narrating the story to the world. The signature below is Abanindra, which is written in a sort of pseudo-Persian font, but it's actually Bangla. So there's an experiment with the font also. And this young guy who's representing the child in everybody, and the whole world is here to listen to the story. All kinds of ethnicities are represented. I'm just showing you two close-ups of the two sides. This is the whole image. So you see the left flank and the right flank. But I just touch upon this to say that there was also these get could have beens which we missed by a whisker. Now I come to Tagore himself, being a children's writer. He has written a couple of books, but this one is a favorite of mine called She or He. And this was addressed to Pupe, who was the adopted grandchild of the Tagores. Uh, and this book actually was, these were the stories were told perhaps at some point when Pupe was young, but when the book was published, Pupe was already 16 and Tagore was 76, just 4 years before he died. And you would see that he's also weaving this story of absurdity, but also playing on the imagination of the child. And there are direct references to people, places they know of, you know, persons in their lives, but with a twist, with this absurd exaggeration. the story about so and so coming to meet and behaving in a certain way. It is available in translation in English. I don't know about Hindi, but this is a page from the English translation. And all the illustrations were done by Tagore. By then, Tagore had established himself as quite a reputed artist. That is a different story altogether, but he came forward to um, illustrate them. And to many feel that this, in a way, was also triggered by Sukumar's imagination. It was, in a way, sort of Tagorean response to that. So these are some fantastic characters. On the left is the hare in the moon. On the right is Gandhi Sandung. That is the demon who appears to scare. But even the demons are funny, not so much scary. Or the tree hopper Baba who lives in a tree, or the fox who comes and cries and asks for forgiveness for certain wickedness that he has done. These are the characters, and it's quite lavishly illustrated. They're all line drawings and printed in line block. And in the 1940 came in a mainstream press, this book was published, which became also hugely popular. Um, this was like my father's generation's childhood. And this was prescribed for even school children. There were two editors, Girija Kumar Bose and Sunirmal Bose. Sunirmal Bose was also a poet himself, very lavishly illustrated, excellently produced, hardbound. And this is actually my personal copy that was handed down to me by my father. And it's called Chotoder Chayonika. So, as the name suggests, it's a collection of things, of mostly verses and colored illustrations by Purnachandra Ghosh, Phanibhushan Gupta, all accompanying writings of a cross section of all the luminaries of Bengali literature who also wrote for children. And the one on the left is actually illustrating a poem by Tagore called Amadir Choto Nodi, which talks about Kopai that flows by Shantiniketan. It's a very small rivulet which only is full during the monsoon months and otherwise only knee dip through the year. So, yeah, just some samplings, various illustrators, and quite a few half-tone color, full color illustrations, some half-tone black and white illustration, and the rest was all done in line. And it was a very beautifully produced book for his time. And then I'll end here. This is the story of Ghanada by Premendra Mitra. This is one of the first iconic characters. The last would be somebody like Feluda, that is Satyajit Ray's detective, the private investigator, Pradosh Mitra, known as Feluda. But Ghanada is a character who started appearing in 1945 and continued till 87. So almost for 4 decades, the Ghanada stories kept young audience enthralled. It's not for very young child. It's more sort of a young adult kind of or juvenile audience. And Ghanada is a guy who sits there and weaves stories. These stories actually are very interesting because you travel the world with him, you meet with scientific facts. So all the details, facts and figures are true, although Ghanada's exploits are extraordinary, you know. And it's almost like Ghanada has an alter ego who goes out and does this. But he is stationary there, narrating these in his adda with a bunch of friends, and fantastic stories. And he ends all of them very dramatically. And thereby, Premendra Mitra also introduced the young audience to many facts and figures. And he himself also did enormous amount of research before writing these stories. So they are factually all correct, or no facts given in one of the stories are incorrect. And yet you have this wonderful weave of a fantabulous tale, which is built around this core, often a geographical truth or a scientific truth, and the exploits of Ghanada. So through Ghanada, you get an entry into this world, and this is so much before Google Mama and all this sort of information at the tip of your finger. So you can imagine how it has opened doors and windows in the young child's imagination. And again, Ghanada is a character who's illustrated by many people over the years. Ghanada started off as this clean shaven guy and then grows a handlebar mustache. And then this is another version of Ghanada in a typical expansive mood. But the image that has this is, well, another variation of Granada. So it just gives you an idea of how popular he was over those 4 decades that we exposed to his stories. And even now, the most iconic is this one by Ajit Gupta. This is what has stuck with his Granada fans. But I'll stop here, and in the next opportunity, we will go a little bit in depth about what happens in the post-independence scenario. I think I have taken enough time, and thank you for your patience. If there are any questions, I would be very happy to take them. And mind you, I'm not an expert. I'm just uh, a person with interest in this. So I'm not an historian. I'm approaching it as an artist who's interested in the history of the visuals. So thank you very much for patiently listening, giving it a hearing, and let's see if you have any reactions to it. Thank you. Oops. Yes.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I would like to thank you. It was a wonderful session, sir.
Thank you.
And I think we're still waiting for some questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So all of you here.
So I
if
can't
there
see the
are-
chat box. You will have to. Okay. No, there are some. Here is 10 things that in the chat box. Okay.
So we decided that they'll type it in the
Yes,
chat box.
there is a question. Is PDF of Abul Table available? Yes, it is. But I don't know if it is in the translation. The Bangla PDF is available. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
So the rest of you people, guys, any questions, please type them.
I think people are exhausted. It's quite an overload of information, I guess.
जो बहुत दिलचस्प था और इसमें ये कर सकते हैं कि तुरंत शायद सवाल आ नहीं आ रहे होंगे, तो हम अगली दफे जब अगला सेशन होगा तो हम कलेक्ट कर लेंगे तब तक और सवाल। और क्या हिंदुस्तान में जैसे कलकत्ता बंगाल में ये हुआ, लेकिन तमिल मराठी इन सब में उतना ज़्यादा काम उस तरह से नहीं हुआ।
Well, I wouldn't know. So what I'm talking about is what I know. And that is the trouble with India. You know, it's nobody can know about all the languages. So if you have kind of research going into this, I'm sure there are treasures in every language that can be dug up. But Bengali children's literature is particularly rich. There is no doubt about that. And I'm not comparing it with anybody else, but it is in itself quite a rich literature. But see, even as a Bengali, when I'm going to talk about the post independence scenario, I'm also going to talk particularly about what happened in West Bengal. There are some brilliant things happened after 1971 in Bangladesh. And we don't really have that access. So these geographical borders, I mean, these political borders, not geographical borders, are actually hampering. And in India, we have these linguistic borders, and elsewhere we have this sort of, and so all you get to see is basically our childhood. At least we had options of having Soviet literature and good books at a very nominal price. Now it seems it's almost entirely the Anglophone world which is ruling the children's literature world. But we do have a tradition, we do have a very rich list of writers. Even translating from each other would, I think, fill in a void. But it's also that the quality of the books has to be on par. I mean, why would somebody go for a badly produced book if you have access to a well produced books? And this is something that our publishers are not really aware of, or even if they are aware of, there is always that monetary restriction, because obviously the number of people reading them are not in millions. So marketing, yes, I mean, all these kind of hold you back, but as far as talent is concerned, there is no dearth of it, that I can assure you.
सुष्मिता चौधरी जी का एक सवाल है फेसबुक पर कि could you please comment on the influence on the visual styles?
Yes, there are many, as you obviously saw. The original initial ones were very much influenced by this bazaar style of painting and prints. Then the next thing that comes is very much of Victorian England, or those illustrations and the art of the book. Now, of course, it is wide open. I mean, there are all kinds of influences, and I'll be talking in depth about Ray's illustration. You'd see that how many kinds of things he has done, and some have influences of Chinese brush and ink or Japanese aesthetic. Some would have a sort of very Middle Eastern feel to it. Some are very simple, almost reductive. Some are very decorative. Some have references to sort of Bengal school, Nandalal to Ajanta kind of a schooling. Then there are very realistic things which are almost like film shots, over the shoulder shots. So, and of course, now everybody is exposed to everything. You have access to the world of illustration. So the range is infinite. But initially, I think it was those two sources. One was the folk one, which is the bazaar tradition, from where you have these panjikas or the almanacs being illustrated. Or if you remember the first book, that Bharat Chandra's Annada Mangal, that refers to the kind of Kalighat tradition, or even Dakshina Ranjan's Thakumar Jhuli borrows from a kind of a existing tradition of block making, and that block making tradition again goes back to the Pattas. It's a very kind of 18th, 19th century aesthetics. And the other was direct influence of the imports from Victorian England, because we were a colonized country, and we were always looking up. And in some sense, English literature has also allowed us entry into the world literature. So which is an unintended consequence of learning a language which is spoken, and which also has a very active translation industry. Grimm's fairy tales are originally written in German, but people know about them because they got access to it through English, and then they were immediately translated in Bengali. So, English becomes that bridge with us and the world. A lot of things that come from other languages, whether it's Russian, whether it's Spanish, whether it's Chinese, it's mediated through English. So yes, those were the primary influences, I would say. But then aesthetic choices also vary. Nandalal has certain predisposition because of his training, which you wouldn't see in somebody like Upendra Kishore, for instance. And Rabindranath, he's a unique person because he has never taught in a formal way to draw and paint, apart from some early exercises that everybody of his class would do in their childhood. They will have a drawing teacher to teach them basics of drawing. But that drawing and what he did in his painterly career over the last 20 years of his life, this is very much starting with a doodle. So it is whimsy and fancy and all that sort of stuff is primary. He couldn't care less about anatomical accuracy. So it's quite a wide range of things and sources of inspiration, if you like.
तो तसीम, एक सवाल आप पूछिए, एक मैं पूछता हूँ, क्योंकि बहुत सारे सवाल इधर भी आए हैं और स्टूडेंट्स के भी बहुत सारे सवाल हैं, तो एक एक करके एक आप
मैं क्लब कर देती हूँ बिकॉज थोड़ा सा ओवरलैप है ही सब में.
Okay.
So I'll club those three and convey it. So Ridhima, she's one of our current batch. She was wondering that she was wondering about the incorporation or value of color inclusion in children's literature, because
Well, it is of course now it is almost de facto. It's very inconceivable to think about children's book without color. That's because technology is here and its color can be very easily reproduced. But I don't think that takes away anything from a book like Shajbaat or K.G. Subramanian's books, for instance. They're entirely black and white, or maybe two colors. Even some of Satyajit Ray illustrations, which are done for magazines, were done in black and white. Most of it, actually, and those are much better quality illustrations. You can very cleverly introduce color. It's like what, again, to paraphrase Ray, you'd say that when I was shooting Kanchenjunga in Darjeeling, there was a group which was shooting a commercial Hindi film, and they would wait for days on end, spending lakhs of rupees for the sun to come out because they could only shoot in bright sunlight. Whereas whole of Kanchenjunga, if you think about, there was not a single shot which was using the direct sunlight. So it was all in that muted tones because it was always the overcast sky, which goes with the mood of the film. So he could finish his shoot, pack up, and this group was still waiting because they want the full color of the hills and all the flowers and everything, because to them, you can only shoot in broad daylight. So color is something very similar to that. What does colorful mean? If color doesn't have a significance, then you can add 20 different colors and it will still look quite colorless or garish. You can use two colors and bring out in your imagination of the person 20 colors. And I think successful usage of color is also this balance and this restraint. Going overboard with color is not colorful. So we all have the facility to use color, but how much of it you will use, how much of it is required for that particular work or what you are aiming at. Because we all have to mold ourselves. Now, when you are illustrating for a text, you have to understand the tone and tenor of the text. So once you decide that, okay, this will be the kind of range that I'm going to play with, I think if you can say more with less, I will always go for that. You can, of course, go overboard and do things which are very fantastic. There is this overwhelming the viewer, the spectacle. I think sometimes art, even illustration, works better when you are not aiming at that spectacle, but something which is quiet. Because after all, how do people read books? You don't read books like you go and watch a film, like, 300 people cannot read a book together. You are reading it yourself. So you're having a one-to-one relationship. The same applies to a painting. So there is something very, it requires a sort of one-to-one relationship, a certain peace of mind, a certain quiet. Um, it's very private, you know. So spectacles are necessarily not very private. So if I'm faced with that question, I would answer it like this, that if I can say more with less, I would certainly opt for less, no matter what technology is available. Does that answer your question?
She says, thanks. It does.
Yeah.
सुशील जी अब आप एक पूछ दीजिए.
There was a question, was the introduction of children's literature in local languages addressing a latent need? Of course. There is always a need to read literature in your language. There is no two ways about it. I also believe that a child should be exposed to more languages than one. I don't think, I mean, we as Indians have grown up being many-lingual, you know. So to reduce us to a monolingual status would be bad. But having said that, you know, reading your own language is something always cherishable, you know, and that also connects you with the language. You know, one of the reason that we are losing our connection with our mother tongue is because as children we are reading everything in English, and there is no quality thing provided to us in our own languages. So naturally the child grows up thinking that has a secondary status, and the best is English, you know, because everything, such a variety, such a quality is not available in your mother tongue. Now, one logic is that, okay, these languages are poor in terms of sheer finances, so it's not easy to compete with the quality of the English books. But as you probably have figured out, you know, a lot can be achieved. If there is a will, there is a way. Like shajbaat was reproduced very cheaply, but nobody said that it compromised on quality. So, you know, it is possible, and that it actually opens up that possibility. And I do very strongly feel that there is a very great need of connecting children with the locale. Or you are growing up in sitting in Bangalore thinking about some meadow in central England is is a very incomplete childhood. You should be able to connect with your surroundings, and we all have done that. You know, we have all got transported to different parts of the world while reading something. That's the thing with good literature or great literature, and you should not be deprived of that. But at the same time, you should also be able to connect with the local that you are in. You know, you should not be mentally completely somewhere else, that you lost that connection with where you are. I'm not even using the word root. You know, it's an overused word. But you should be able to connect with your surroundings. That's as simple as that. I see a lot of children now who are reading American literature are growing up more. Mental space is not here, it's there. And it is inevitable, because all good literature will talk about and it is not intrinsically bad or good. It's when it is supplanting all your connection with your surrounding, then it becomes a negative force. Good literature is good literature no matter where it is coming from and which language you are reading it, provided, like Gandhiji said, na, I would like all the doors and windows open and let the wind of the world pass through my house, but I refuse to be blown over. You know, my house will be open, you know, doors and windows will be open, the breeze will come from all four directions, but the house should not be blown away in that wind. And this is something sometimes we forget. Well, there is another question. It says, how accessible were these books across the classes? Well, there was no problem of access as long as you could read and write, because these were not very expensive books. They were also there in the public libraries. But unfortunately, our country, the rate of illiteracy has always been very high, and that has some class component attached to it, unfortunately, you know. So I can't really deny that reality, but it wasn't as if it was barred to some people. But access, if you are not literate, for whatever reason, not necessarily your fault, but it's a societal problem that if you don't have, you can't read, then you don't have access. It's as simple as that. And unfortunately, a large part of the society cannot read. Like poet Shakti Chattopadhyay once said that, there are so many poets, I don't know, they remain unknown because they can't even read and write. And there are so many audiences of good poetry that we haven't accessed because there are so many people who can't read and appreciate a poem. So yes, that is a problem. Wish he lived longer, and it would have gotten curiouser and curiouser. He was a very sharp mind, and he was a Brahmo himself, and he was critiquing Brahmo Samaj from inside. It's all his pretentiousness and all the internecine fights. There are things which are not necessarily not meant for very young audience that he has written, which are very critical. Chalachitta Chanchuri and other stuff. But he's also has retained the child in him. Without retaining that, you cannot address the child's imagination in the way he did Pagladashu, for instance. Here is a character who challenges the good guys, the first boy in the class, who and embarrass them publicly and to everybody's delight. So you immediately make a connection with, except if you are one of those quote unquote good guys, and so which is what the majority of us were in the school, and that's what this whole stories are about. And Pagladashu is available in Hindi. I saw it in the net the other day. There is some Hindi translations made. I actually had a personal copy of Hindi Pagladashu. So I don't know. I mean, what you expect me to say, but he was absolutely a remarkable character as far as um, children's literature goes. And I think Bengali literature is exceptionally lucky to have a person like that. It's not every day you get somebody like that. In 35 years, he has covered so much ground. And I'm not even talking about his scientific learnings. I mean, can you imagine somebody writing a parody of a science fiction? Professor Hesharam Hoshiar's diary, which is Professor Hesharam Hoshiar is going into some uncharted areas of Karakoram and finding these strange animals. There is one animal called Chillanoceros, jo chillate hain, and sits like a baby and howls. There is another character called Lagbagarnicus, who's a bit standing on a rickety feet. And they're all collecting samples. So in a way, it is a sort of a reference to Conan Doyle and many other sort of scientific, science fiction, what we call. It's not a science fiction, it's a parody of a science fiction being written in 1915 is quite remarkable by any standard. Or his play Lakshman is Shaktisel, the kind of that Lakshman is down, and Hanuman is being sent to fetch the Vishallakarani. And Hanuman refuses to go. So he's being bribed with bananas. And then he says, I wouldn't know which shop to go to. And then he shouted at saying that you think this is you're being sent to the Badgate company in Chorangi. You will have to find the herb in the mountain. And so there are dialogues in there which even you read them, you're kind of astounded by the sharpness of it. And the references are so multi-layered. So anything you read, there is this poem in Abul Table called The Rule of 21, where you apparently land in a country where everything is conducted by the rule of 21. And for the trivial mistakes, you will be fined for 20 times or you will be jailed for 21 years. So everything is basically 21 years. In any absurd situation you live in and you think, oh my God, I'm living in this rule of 21. So it's like phrase, in regular conversation, you quote him, he becomes part of that, the myth, the part of the language. So if you say Kushain, you are referring, and anybody who has read that poem would immediately know what you're talking about. So that becomes part of the canon. And he is definitely a part of the canon. Or you refer to as somebody as, oh, he's a pagladashu. Immediately people know what you're talking about. So yes, he's quite exceptional.
बहुत सारे तो चीज़ें हैं जो इस व्याख्यान की तारीफ में है। इस तरह की कुछ चीज़ें हैं कि चंद्रिमा भट्टाचार्य जी कह रही हैं कि क्या नारायण देवनाथ को याद करना था?
Yes, that will come in the post-independence section. Yes.
तनिदा के बारे में तनिदा.
Yes, all that will come in the post-independence section. I've stopped in the 1945. So, yeah, this is a sort of a rough survey, and in any talk you cannot be like an encyclopedia where you mention everybody. So I will have to apologize beforehand that not every illustrator that you who is in the know may consider important will be touched upon, but I want to touch the most important highlights, and Narayan Devnath definitely will come in for discussion in the next session. So yes, Chandrima.
क्या हम 2-4 सवाल और ले सकते हैं? एक है पीयू महापात्रा का सवाल है, वो कह रही हैं अमर चित्रकथा was a part of our childhood and at the same time we had Russian folk tales printed from the land of Soviet. The approaches were so different, and maybe we would like to hear from you how the land influences the stories and images.
Amar Chitrakatha served a very basic need of people to at least be familiar with some of these stories. But there are many issues with Amar Chitrakatha, which if you read the Amar Chitrakatha on Tagore, you would know exactly what I'm talking about. It's very partial. It has got a very limited understanding of the expanse. It turns Tagore almost into a Vedic sage. And it's sort of important that he started this ashram school. The ashram school actually became a world university. That was the whole thing. So pushing him into this Gurudev status of a sort of a Hindu sage who started going back to the Tapobon is perhaps very limiting. But having said that, and I do have problems with the manner in illustration also happened. You can analyze it as sexist, as all kinds of things. All dark-skinned people are negative. All fair-skinned people are positive. So you analyze them and you see. But all said and done, it did serve a very important purpose because it at least introduced people to certain stories which they wouldn't otherwise. Because like somebody said, millennial attention span. तो millennial attention span तो millennia आने के पहले से शुरू हो गया था reduce होने का. That's also because of our school system, because now we are expecting everybody to score something like 98, 99, 100, which is absurd. I wish Pagladashu was here amongst us. It is totally absurd. But that's what we have painted ourselves in that corner. And I think we have to get out of there. People need spare time. People need time to think, to imagine. You cannot, guide a child like, gaadi patri pe aa gaye aur chalne lage. People will deviate. People need time to go and do things that they love. तो हमारे पास तो टाइम ही नहीं है, खेलने का भी टाइम नहीं है, तो किताब पढ़ने का टाइम कहाँ है? पढ़ो 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 पढ़ो, नहीं तो ट्यूशन जाओ. This is crazy. I think we are losing what is childhood. But anyway, that's a pet peeve. I don't want to go there. But Amar Chitra Katha is not great literature. It basically makes the lowest common denominator from great literature. वो थोड़ा दूध के बदले आपको छाछ दिया गया है types. The Russian stories, on the other hand, were sometimes great literature. There are Tolstoy stories, Maxim Gorky stories, or many other sort of lesser known. Alexander Belayev, I still remember, Amphibian Man. It's a great story, greatly illustrated, wonderfully produced book. So those are actually take you and look at the quality of the illustration. My God, some of the best artists illustrated them, because in the Soviet Union, push these books in many languages. So translation industry was very active. It was translating only for a country like India. There were so many languages that it was being translated in. Bangla majorly, they would take people to Moscow to sit there and translate and pay for it. And then these books were being sent here for almost no price at all, because the Communist Party couldn't contribute to Communist Party. So this was a kind of a dealing that they would make some money by selling those books. So books were being sold in every opportunity, 2 rupees, 3 rupees. The quality of the books that you got were amazing. Good paper, excellent illustration, wonderful stories. Often the translation is also of a very high order. I mean, what more can you ask for? So I don't think we can compare these two things. They are as different as chalk and cheese.
आज का जो भी इलस्ट्रेशन के काम आप देख पा रहे हैं, या कहानियाँ, कविताएं, जो टेक्स्ट है, उसमें अभी कुछ ऐसे हैं जो आप जिनका उदाहरण दे सकते हैं, जो आपको बहुत लगता है कि हाँ ये ठीक रास्ता है, या जो आपको बहुत
there are lots of good efforts happening. I see that in Marathi, I see that in Bangla, I see that in Malayalam, I see that in Hindi. It's just that sometimes, because of problems of distribution, accessibility, it always doesn't reach the whole of the target audience that one would like to. So like I would love some Bangladeshi books to be available in Kolkata. It's difficult. There is only one shop that sells Bangladeshi literature, and that too is not specializing in children's literature. So even in spite of the fact that both these sides of Bengal speak the same language, you don't really have access to each other's books. Forget about other languages. But I know this Vachu Anande was an attempt in Marathi where they used artists' works along with writings for children, which is a wonderful idea, I think. Then I see a lot of tribal and folk art being incorporated in illustrating ideas or being seen from there, like Maina Chitrakar saying Sita's Ramayana, where it's seen from Sita's point of view, or somebody doing a book on Martin Luther King, which a black person is narrating, and the illustration is being done by a Patachitrakar. Then there are some brilliant illustrators and designers working, and we have always had that. It's just that the quality books are not the ones which are easily available. The access, the reach that Amar Chitra Katha had, would a Mickey Patel book have? It never had that. So that is something. We had a National Book Trust, we have Children's Book Trust, we have Nehru Bal Pustakalaya. But, where would you find their books? only in the melas and fairs, or only if you're visiting Delhi? Are they that widely available? No. I mean, so that is what I think need to be looked at. It's not just the quality of illustration, designing, or even writing. I think we have very high quality of writers, but ये सब तालमेल हो जाता है ना. बांग्ला में बोलते हैं मुड़ी मिचरी एक दर. तो sometimes the good, the bad, the ugly, everything gets mixed up, and the bad and the ugly are more widely available than the good. So these are the things, anomalies that needs to be corrected. I think we have enough talent, and there has to be a bit of a cross pollination between languages. Otherwise, we are all living in our own silos. So translation, and that's what I think Ektara is doing, that getting things translated for children from other languages, and that is wonderful. Like Hindi mein jo likha hai, that should be translated, and other languages are very rich, and there are things that are jewels which needs to be translated and reached at the door. It is like Ramakrishna said a very interesting thing, that people queue up in a bar, but the milkman comes home to deliver the milk. So sometimes you will have to forcibly deliver the milk at the doorstep, because people have a tendency of queuing up in the bar, and that is true about children's literature as well. So choice between drinking milk and drinking wine, I think more people will go for wine. I'm not saying that wine necessarily is a bad thing. I'm not making a moral judgment, but you need to have it in the childhood, and that often has to reach home. So an extra effort is required to be made, and it has been made in the past. It is being made, but if it is consolidated a little more, I think the effectiveness of it will increase. And that question of whether it reaches every class, and I'm not even bringing caste here, because that is also something intrinsically connected in India, then yes, it requires to, find new ways of reaching out.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes,
On So P.U. Mahapatra is curious to know your views on audio or video children books.
they're fine. That all mediums need to be explored, but the fun of reading is something quite special. And you may read, you may hear an audio book. It's somebody's interpretation, right? And that might get you hooked. I'll tell you one example. I heard this Dylan Thomas play, Under Milkwood, iconic, classic. Richard Burton is narrating the story. It's wonderful. It sort of opens the doors. But then you read it, it's so good, the reading. It's a mono voice, and he kind of does all the characters and the narration. When I read the book, I could see other layers that I missed while I was listening. So they're two very different experiences. It's a good way to introduce people, to get them, to lure them in. But I think the ultimate pleasure will be also in reading it. There are different registers. When you're listening, it affects certain registers. When you are reading, it affects certain other registers, because you can actually mull over. You can go over a sentence 3 times. You don't have that luxury when you are listening to an audio book, right? So it's like reading a good book once, twice, thrice. The first time you read because of the plot, because okay, the plot is grabbing. The next time you read because you are interested in certain characters and you feel okay, I might have missed out 1 or 2 things. Third time you read, you realize that there are these sort of hidden narratives in the story which I missed in the first 2 readings. So yeah, that applies. But yeah, these audiobooks are going to stay here, because it's also something that you could hear while doing something else. But in a way, it sort of also tells you that people don't have the time to sit down and read. So they are doing something or driving and listening to the story. But, something is always better than nothing. So if you get exposed to good literature through audiobooks, so be it. Then ultimately, maybe it'll interest you to read a couple of them. And that's everybody's gain. And there are very good audiobooks, so you can't complain about the quality. But yeah, of course, one has to keep in mind the quality of audiobooks. I just referred to one, the Dylan Thomas Under Milkwood is a wonderful audio. Not all audios are of that standard, but like I said, some of the stories of Takuma Julie were made into little audio plays. They made into a film, but that was a ghastly film. But audios were much better, and they have also circulated for one generation. They were hugely popular. So one of the reason that this book is popular, it will be explored by other mediums. It's quite natural. Who am I to give a value judgment? These are all valid forms. So as long as you reach out, it's good enough. But ultimately, if you also calm down to read, then you also figure out certain things which you may not. And audiobooks, because of the atmospheric, you can add music, you can add rhyme, rhythm, tune, atmospheric sounds, make it very dramatic and make it very appealing. So people who are not used to reading will get attracted to that, and you can reach out to that audience through that means, or you can lure that audience into this audience by via that route. So there are many approaches. There is nothing against or for it. It's great. It's a medium. It needs to be explored.
तज़ीन सवाल तो बहुत सारे हैं, लेकिन हमें अब खत्म करना पड़ेगा क्योंकि 2 घंटे लगभग हो चुके हैं। तो अगर चाहें तो एक आखिरी सवाल, और अगर आपकी इजाजत हो।
Yes, please.
एक और सवाल ले सकते हैं। तज़ीन, आप
शायद अपनी चैट बॉक्स में बीच के कुछ रह गए थे, क्योंकि आखिरी के तो निकल आई थी। सो आदित्य जानना चाह रहे थे whether Sukumar Ray was the first person to attempt nonsense verse in India. To
my knowledge, yes. In that, in such widely, yes. And nobody has produced a whole book of absurd things before him. Not that I know of. So I have limited knowledge, but yes, in my knowledge, yes.
And Anusha had a methodological question, sort of. She wanted to know, like, how does one go about acquainting oneself with the history of children's illustration in their own language?
Hard work, dig it, and go to people. There are collectors who've been collecting books, and there are libraries which are repositories. It's not something that you will find readily available. If you really are into the research, there's a lot of work. There's waiting there to happen, and you may be the person to do it. So by all means, if this inspires you to dig into your own language and its history, whether it's illustration per se or illustration for children or literature for children, you just go and dig, because a lot of work is waiting to be done.
Thank you so much. I think that's it.
शुक्रिया इंद्रप्रमित जी, बहुत ही एक शानदार व्याख्यान के लिए। और आप सबका जो फेसबुक पर जुड़े हैं उन सबका भी बहुत शुक्रिया। शुरू से आखिर तक मैं देख रहा था कि सारे ही लोग बने हुए हैं, ये बड़ा कमाल है। और अगले हफ्ते मतलब 30 तारीख को हम फिर 4 बजे मिलेंगे। बहुत शुक्रिया।
थैंक यू।